Hello, Jacqueline. Thank you very much indeed for joining us again on the Housing Sector Podcast. We had a great conversation last time about antisocial behaviour and very much how it was for people who were themselves the victims of antisocial behaviour. And I don't want to in any way diminish that, because that's very important. But I wanted to take a look, if we may, at the sort of other side of it for people who are perhaps perpetrators of antisocial behaviour, and why that might happen, and what powers we have, housing associations have, communities have, to address this information, to address this sort of behaviour that is obviously deeply impactful and harmful on other people. And before I ramble too much, we sort of recently re-engaged on a conversation on evictions, and I said, well, what happens to these people that we evict? What do we do to them? So thank you very much for coming on, Jacqueline. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. It was quite a productive conversation, I think, we had last time. And yeah, I'm happy to be visiting you again to explore this quite complex issue. Yeah.
Yeah,
So what are
absolutely.
my thoughts on, should we start firstly on the idea of evictions and what happens to
Yes.
the perpetrators? Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously the government is saying anyway that they're going to take a more hardline position in terms of eviction for perpetrators, and it's sort of like three strikes you're out type of approach. That's going to mean that perpetrators are evicted, and where they go is one question. But for me, I think where I'd like to start really is how housing providers are going to determine who the perpetrator is.
Yeah.
And that to me is the first concern, right? So what we saw in our report, in our survey that we did last year on antisocial behavior, and when we say our, I mean Social Housing Action Campaign, which is who conducted the survey. What we found was that a lot of, aside from the issue of a lack of intervention and actually a complete lack of contact from some landlords when they were alerted by their tenants and residents to antisocial behavior, another issue is the really poor standard of investigation, and also the lack of credibility given to genuine complaints of antisocial behavior. And in some cases, which we saw more often than we expected to see, was victims being accused of being perpetrators, even when they had clear evidence that they were being victimized.
Yeah.
Okay. So my concern is, before we even get to an eviction process, right? Can we trust that landlords and adjacent agencies such as, local authorities, environmental health, who deal with noise complaints, the police, can we see, number one, a cogent, effective analysis of antisocial behavior complaints that are fairly examined and thoroughly examined? And secondly, will we see them working in collaboration with relevant agencies to determine who the perpetrators are, and then what the appropriate actions are? Because what we see is that sometimes perpetrators are troubled, right? Yeah. Now, that's a different subject we can get into in this, because this brings us to another element, in the discussion of evictions. What if the perpetrator is genuinely has sort of issues that really should be addressed more appropriately in another way other than evicting them? But before we even get there, we have to first determine who the perpetrators are and have confidence that that decision has been arrived at appropriately. Now, I'm going to tell you now that I lack confidence in that process completely. And that's not just from personal experience, but that's from a significant number of people that engage with SHAC, but also just pervasively across sort of social media where this discussion is being had about antisocial behavior. The quality of their investigations tend to take the form of what's easiest for them, what can allow them to most quickly discharge their duties. Um, Investigations that are used to sort of silence victims so that they can kind of go away, or to punish victims who are highlighting the failings of their landlord, you know. So I think that's, again, it's very easy to say, and there will be people who, ASB victims, who would be relieved at the idea that their perpetrator is just going to get evicted, right? But even victims cannot have confidence in that rhetoric. And I call it rhetoric at the moment because it doesn't go to the heart of the issues, right? First of all, there has to be a requirement for landlords to respond. Then they have to respond effectively. And when we say effectively, we mean in accordance to their policies, which are almost always written in a way that aligns with the ASB Crime and Policing Act 2014, which is what discharges all of these powers, devolves all of these powers to landlords in how they can address antisocial behavior. So there's informal and formal measures available to them to do that. And there's clear instruction provided onto how they're meant to engage with other agencies. Now, providing they do that and they arrive at a sort of robust outcome that is reasonable and fair, then if you want to follow through with sort of like whatever threats, and you've actually accurately identified who the victim is and who the perpetrator is, and then what measures can be taken, because eviction really should be a last resort.
Yeah.
What measures can be taken amongst all of your other measures that are available to you, and you exhaust those, yeah, then you arrive at eviction and say, okay, that's it, fine. But it's the process that leads to the eviction, before we even talk about where they go. The process that leads to that, the investigation, the exploration of other measures, and whether they follow their policy in all other aspects in terms of how well they're communicating with the victim and the perpetrator, whether they're encouraging mediation, whether mediation is safe, whether, you've got to do all that stuff first. And I think that there is not a proper acknowledgement. I mean, my view going into the research that we did last year and coming out of it is that the government is not taking seriously the failings of housing providers in terms of how they are engaging and responding to antisocial behavior. That is what needs to be addressed, right? Because if you can deal with that, then the rest will follow to some degree. The person who's responsible to avoid and to stop antisocial behavior is the tenant, right? We know that. It's the resident. So that primarily lies with them. But in the event that it happens, the landlord's response is crucial to both the experience of the victim and the outcomes for the perpetrator. And that's what the government is in everything that they've said from the time that they released this ASB, this sort of relaunch of their ASB policy in, I think it was March 2023. They're having looked through it. There's just they talk about giving powers they have powers. They've got loads. They have powers to deal more effectively with the situation the way it is in terms of the prevalence of antisocial behavior. I don't doubt that it's quite a significant problem, and that there are other issues that make it hard to enforce the powers that they have. But I don't think that there's any real excuse for the neglect and the abject, refusal to utilize the powers that are available to them. And to me, you can talk about evictions all day long, but unless there is some sort of compliance there, in terms of using what they have and making sure that their investigations are properly conducted, then the eviction thing is just a no-go, really.
So if we've got someone who isn't under any there aren't any mental issues there, they are just someone who plays their music loud most weekends, argues with whoever, is just a nuisance. Are they at the point now where they go, well, the housing associations aren't doing anything about it, so there's no actual threat there, so why would I curtail my behaviour? Why would I stop behaving the way I am?
I think that is exactly what people do. I mean, if you really believe that you're going to lose your home,
Yeah.
you're not really going to put, most people who are not, don't have a sort of like mental health condition or anything like that. They just like loud music, or they just like being a bit rowdy. They like being around people. That person who is that, what you call that is a lifestyle difference.
Mm.
Okay. And fair enough, but one of the problems that we have, I think, in when we're talking about antisocial behavior, is that sort of loss of a sense of community,
Yeah.
and this sort of focus on individualism to the point where there is not that consideration for the person next door. If you think about um, in a time gone by where everybody kind of knew each other on the streets, and people, you knock on the door and play with there's a sense of community there, and a
Mm.
sense of sort of like a sort of village feel, even if you're living in the city, some time ago. That's not really the case now. People are quite individualistic, and so they engage in behaviors in their home without thought of how that might be affecting, the person on the outside. And so sometimes I think it's just a matter of the landlord coming in and creating that sense of awareness for that person, and that sense of accountability for them to maintain that sense of awareness once the landlord has left, and go, you are living in a setting amongst other people, and you need to be aware of that. And I think if that person, is not being malicious, but they just, have to be made aware, then most people will comply, I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
right? We have a lot of situations. And again, the ASB Crime and Policing Act is very clear on the need for early intervention, because they understand, it's an established fact statistically that the earlier you get involved in antisocial behavior, the less likely it is to escalate. Well, the problem that we have is when landlords fail to intervene early on and appropriately, ASB cases almost always escalate. And a big reason for that is because the perpetrator thinks, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, it's pervasive. This is like recognized even in like sort of wider crime. If criminals or potential criminals do not believe that there's going to be consequences for their crimes, they will freely commit them even more, brazenly than they would otherwise. So that's a reality that we have to deal with. And this is again going back to landlord behavior. If they don't intervene, the ASB is very likely to not just escalate in frequency, but also in severity.
This is the problem you say with the crime. My wife was in a supermarket, the smaller supermarket, local store up the road, and was queuing to pay for her shopping. And three or four guys just came in, grabbed what they wanted off the shelves, and walked out. And the woman behind my wife said, "Why don't we all do that?" There doesn't seem to be any upcoming. There's nothing to deter at the moment.
Absolutely.
Okay, but what if I so let's but so I'm a housing association, I'm dealing with damp and mold and fire risks and rent and service charges. At what point do I say, look, you just got to get on with each other? This isn't up to us. Is there an element of that?
It's hard to know what landlords are really thinking when they behave the way that they do, unless they sort of articulate, their innermost thoughts as to why they behave the way that they do. I would imagine that there are stresses on the sort of housing sector. I think we have to acknowledge that, but at the same time, I think there are a number of internal factors, just in terms of lack of training.
Mm.
People just not really understanding and it's putting the work in to really identify if it's antisocial behavior in the first place, because sometimes it really is what you would call it, and I referred to this before, as a lifestyle difference,
Mm.
and people are just different, right? And you like to have garden parties in the summer, and we don't. Or we like to have children playing. We have kids over a lot, and they sort of make a lot of noise, and you're in your house, and you're not accustomed to that sort of noise. And there is an element where there are lifestyle differences, and there should be tolerance between tenants. But the reality is that beyond that, I'm not sure that most people who persist, most people, and there will be some who are just hypersensitive
Mm.
and are just, chronic complainers. There will always be people like that, right? But I don't think that that's the majority of people. I think that most people don't want an ASB case. They don't want the tensions with their neighbors. They just want to live peaceably. And by the time they contact their landlord, it's because the situation has probably gone on long enough, or there is something happening that is beyond the scope of, like, if they're lighting fires, or there's, like, they're damaging property, or they're behaving in a way that's actually quite scary. They often like to say, go and speak to the neighbor yourself and see if you can sort of reach an understanding, but that's not always possible, right? Because if it's a content, if right away that what they're doing is that, they're scary.
Mm.
They're
Yeah.
scary. This is like, I'm not sure how they're going to take me just talking to them. Then you will get your landlord involved, and there is enough sort of like legal infrastructure around the situation to where they should get involved, and they are expected legally to respond to, even though there's no law that says that you must respond to antisocial behavior. The It is clear in the legislation, particularly the ASB Crime and Policing Act, that they should. And it is incumbent upon them to, and it's their responsibility to. And that's in the policies as well, that they assume a role of investigators, they assume a role of mediators, in the sense, not in the actual sense in terms of actual providing actual mediation, but mediators, sort of informally, in terms of going in between these two households and trying to reach a solution to stop things from escalating. That's the role they are meant to take, and tenants are right to expect them to do that, right? And so it's difficult. I think it depends on the severity of the ASB that's happening, whether tenants should just try to figure it out on their own. I think it very much depends on the circumstances, and also the sort of nature of the households as well. So if you've got like a one household that's a large family of people, and then you've got someone who's single living by themselves, might be a little bit scary to go to them and say, "Can you turn your music down?" You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So I think that landlords certainly should be engaged enough to use discretion, and to sort of like anticipate what that situation might feel like from the tenant's point of view, and to provide whatever support that they can to try to resolve that situation before it becomes a bigger one. And in the end, that benefits them as well. That if they engage well, then you're not likely to have a complaint on the other end that you're going to have to put through various stages, and then you're going to have to answer to the housing ombudsman, and then you might now, because this is happening more and more, risk being, said to the media and being blasted, across,
Yeah.
if you just deal with it properly from the beginning, it helps you too as a landlord, right? So um, I think that it's never really good to go, you all just go and figure it out, because there's lots of reasons why that might be difficult. And that's again where investigation comes in, where you actually try to get a, a, um, a scope of what the circumstances are, so that you can know how to respond, and what to encourage the complainant to do, to say, well, have you tried this? Can you try that? Do you feel safe speaking to them? Okay, then we'll respond this way, or we'll respond that way. That's where investigation comes in, right? So that they know how to deal with it. But I don't think there's ever room to just assume that it's the tenants who just should just figure it out, not in the first instance anyway.
An issue that came through my resident support site was there was quite a good relationship with the neighbors, but it was the children. It was who were sort of mid-teens, and the parents couldn't control them. And then they were having more friends hanging around in the car parking area and in the gardens. And there was this sort of intimidation as well. But the parents themselves weren't able to manage their children. What do we, I mean, where do we even start to untangle that one? Because it's not really fair for me to evict a perfectly good neighbor on because the kids are behaving badly.
That's a really tricky one, and I've got kids. My kids, one of them she's a young adult now, and I've got a little boy, and I can't. That's a tricky situation, and I'm empathetic, to a point. Legally you're responsible for your kids, and
Yeah.
that's just the easy legal answer, right? You're responsible for your kids, so you need to manage them, and you need to try to find ways, take the initiative upon yourself to try to get support to do that, to be informed about how you can improve your parenting. I mean, that's just your job,
Yeah.
right? You've got those kids, and I know that that's a very simplistic response, and that it's complicated. I'm a mother myself, and I have a high needs household. I deal with disability in my home and things like that. So I know it's very rarely black and white, but that's the first response. That is ultimately true, though, because regardless of your circumstances, you are responsible for them
Yeah.
as a parent. And I think the complexities of that in the relationship between the parents itself, I mean, that's difficult because they get along, and it's not them directly, the adults aren't directly causing any issues with each other, but you've got these kids. I mean, this is where I touched on before, between like what other resources can be accessed before eviction. And if there are, if it's a situation where they're potentially or are causing these teenagers causing antisocial behavior, then you're looking at maybe social services getting
Yeah.
involved, or maybe any community initiatives to kind of, deal with those young people. The reality is, and going back to this in terms of a sense of community, and this is why we put this at the end of the report, the first report that we did following the ASB survey, is that I think if you look at the original sort of philanthropic role of social housing, it's completely moved away from that now. Now it's like not just corporate, but like corporate psychopathy, right? But if you go back to the sort of charitable endeavors and the sort of sense of the philanthropic aspect of it, then there's a role that I think landlords have in sort of creating community as a sort of antidote to, and a sort of like an inoculation against ASB in a way, creating spaces that allow people to build relationships, create a sense of community, and embedded in that a sense of accountability, right?
Yeah.
When you have play parks and community centers and sort of like hubs for various demographics inside that community. I know it's easier said than done, but again, I think that if you build housing with those things in mind and create spaces and opportunities to facilitate that, then that I think would go some way to creating that sense of accountability and responsibility, to where kids would feel more self-conscious about behaving a certain way because they're a part of a community.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm saying is kind of like it doesn't address situations that already exist. But I think if we're talking about coming up with solutions on how to address antisocial behavior, we have to have that conversation. We have to talk about being proactive rather than just reactive. And I think that housing, if it was engaged with its original purpose, this could easily be factored in to. I mean, they always like to show off about all the great things they're doing with their residents. So they know that there's a sense of they have to justify the charitable status,
Yeah.
right? Like they know they're supposed to be doing things like that. So this is not what I'm saying is not that far out, it's not that sort of like random for me to say, well, why don't we have things that really encourage community and activities that the landlord actively tries to facilitate and encourage? I don't think, loneliness is a huge epidemic. I don't think that people, you will have some uptake of services like that, you will have people who want things like that, and for their children, for their young people. So I think that I can't think of what to do sort of once a situation like that is happening, other than what I've said. I don't know how serious, in your hypothetical situation, I don't know how serious. Don't Was it a real situation you gave me, or just
Yeah. Yeah.
hypothetical?
Yeah. It
No,
was someone that
it's a real
contacted me.
situation,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know how serious that antisocial behavior is. I mean, there are informal measures or formal measures that can be taken to address that behavior. And that's the reality that they face with those young people, and it's unfortunate. But yeah, the landlord can do those things. Should it result in eviction? Well, it depends on the kids. And you know, and I have to speak. I will say to you, I'll be honest with you and say that I think from Shaq's point of view, it is important for us to have, not to be impartial, because it's a tenants and residents organization, right? And we're speaking from the experience of the tenants. But I do think it's important that when we're having these discussions to be sort of fair and balanced and to try to look at things from different perspectives, right? So I have this discussion with you with that in mind. But I'm going to be totally transparent and just say, just as a human being, I look at this as a victim.
Mm.
I look at this from the point of view as a victim, having been an ASB victim and having had a landlord who did not address it appropriately, and being a part of an organization where you know, there are so many people who are in that situation. You know, if eviction is the only thing available, and if you've got to choose as a victim between that person getting evicted, as much as you like the parents, and your mental health,
Yeah.
or your child who's having a panic attack and scared to go to and from school because of the boys that are out there, or whoever, boys or girls that are out there that are creating mayhem, then get, you know, like if that's what's going to give me, I'm going to choose my family, I'm going to choose my sanity, you know. And it's not the victim's fault that there isn't a better system to address this. But what can you do? You
Well,
know?
I think again we've lost the housing officer role, who was within the community when we were local housing providers providing community support.
Yeah,
And you had a housing officer that could have a cup of tea with you, oh okay, and
right.
then have a cup of tea next door, and then maybe get you together and offer that
Absolutely.
early mediation. So much could be learnt by having a local presence that I think we've lost as these housing associations have become, so more corporate and spread out, and lost the focus on the community and the locality. Look, we're running out of time again, Jacqueline. It's been great. And again, I don't think we've even scratched the surface, have
No,
we,
we
really?
haven't. We haven't at all.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. Let's have you back again. And but it's been great talking to you again. Thank you very much indeed.
Angie, thanks so much. You take care, yeah?
Thank you.